This lecture is about war in daily life. I'm going to discuss not only the human costs of war, which we don't often talk about when we get lost in strategy and battle and debates over what the U.S.'s next strategic move should be, and also the ways in which mainstream media coverage can be limited, and the wonderful possibilities for independent bloggers working on their own to bring forth information. Now, just by way of a little bit of background, this is the increase in US military spending from 2000 to 2014. And this figure does come from the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which is a nonpartisan um, congressional fact-finding office that puts together really reports on anything. I recommend that you check it out if you want to know anything about projected taxes, the costs of social programs, the costs of certain tax cuts, all of those things. And you can see that right now, or the last data available, 2014, we're up to $500 billion in military budget, which is a huge amount of money. It's about 6% of our national budget. Now, I wanted to also give you, by way of background, this map of the region in the Middle East where we are involved in the most wars right now. A lot of people aren't that familiar with the region, right? And I think when we start to think of it as a place over there, far away, where foreign, possibly backward people live, then that dehumanizes people in a way that allows us to really be immune to the human aspects of war. I want you to keep in mind that each of these countries that we're talking about has a different culture, history, and that this is a huge region of the world, and that they are countries that most of us know fairly little about. I do hope that in reading the blog, reading Riverbend's blog, you now know a little bit more about Iraq and the people that live there. Now, I want to give you a brief background. Again, I'm not sure how many people know the histories of the region and of the various countries. Starting with Afghanistan, that's our first war that we entered in 2001. And there's a long history of U.S. involvement there. In 1979 to 1989, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. And the US's foreign policy at the time was to contain the spread of communism. So, in order to do that, the US armed and trained al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, to fight the USSR in Afghanistan. That war resulted in about 1 million civilian casualties and 5 million refugees. We do think about civilian casualties a lot, but only recently, as the Syrian refugee crisis escalated, have we been thinking really about how many people are displaced from their homes in times of war. Now, as a result, like I said, 5 million refugees in Afghanistan, the Taliban rose to power and Sharia law was instituted. Wasn't necessarily what was going to happen before the US intervened, but the US felt that Sharia law was preferable to communism at the time. Now, in 2001, we have had a very different position after the Taliban struck us in New York City and Washington, D.C. The US decided to invade Afghanistan for allowing al-Qaeda to continue to operate in its borders. And that war has resulted in 20,000 civilian deaths. And try and think about how many people that is. That's a huge number of civilian deaths. Unfortunately, the numbers are only going to get worse as I talk about some of our other wars in the region. Iraq. Again, an area where we may know about the most recent war, but the US has a long history of involvement. From 1980 to 1988, the US provided arms and monetary support for Saddam Hussein's regime in the Iraq-Iran war. There were over 1 million civilian casualties on both sides there. So you're starting to see a theme now of the US supporting people who we turn out to not want to support. In 1991, Saddam Hussein's government, Iraq under Saddam Hussein's rule, invades Kuwait and the US invades Iraq. The war was fairly quickly won under George Bush I. But from 1992 to 2003, there were continued economic sanctions against Iraq, and this really crippled the economic development of the country in a lot of ways. Now, from the period 2001 to 2003, the Bush administration began to claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, that was the excuse for going to war with Iraq. Almost every congressperson and senator voted for the war based on this inaccurate information. We did invade Iraq in 2003, but the weapons of mass destruction were never found, and we now believe never existed in the first place. The war has cost us $2.2 trillion overall, 165,000 civilian direct deaths. And so this is from Brown's website on the cost of war. And what direct deaths means is this is the number of people who have directly been hit by airstrikes, hit by stray bullets, caught in the crossfire. That does not include the number of people who have developed diseases because they lack clean water. It does not include the rise in the infant mortality rate as a result of the destruction of government infrastructure and services. And this war created 1.9 million refugees. And so when we think about what we hear, that's just sort of an overview. When we think about what we hear about the war, I think depending on when we were born, it can be very limited, right? We all heard that there were weapons of mass destruction. And I want you to keep in mind that the mainstream press is controlled by very powerful forces. And I'll give you an example. In 2004, Ted Koppel proposed to read the names of all the soldiers who had been killed in action in the Iraq War in the preceding year. The Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which is one of the affiliates of ABC that would have broadcast the show in a number of cities, refused to air the show. They claimed that reading the names of the dead soldiers was specifically constituted anti-war bias, and that was not information that they were going to publicize to the country. And so when we think about the type of information that we get, let's always keep in mind that there are these gatekeepers and editors, there are government regulations, and there are limitations from the corporate ownerships. Even something as simple as wanting to read the names of dead soldiers in order to honor them can be controversial and can be shut down based on the political feelings of the people in control. And so that's really why I think it's so important and so exciting, although that's a weird word to use in the context of war, that we do have the possibilities of blogging and bringing in these alternative forms of expression and alternative ways of gaining information. And one of them that you read was Baghdad Burning. It's the story of one Iraqi girl. It also obviously includes very harsh criticism of the US government involvement in Iraq, but also a glimpse into the daily life in Baghdad during the occupation. Now, this is completely unauthorized, completely unsupported. The feminist press did actually make a book out of it, so I do have it. So if it disappears from the internet, I will still have it in hard copy. But I think it really gives you a much different picture from the picture that you might get of battle strategies, of conflict on the news. The other thing that I think does happen, this is my theory, is that because we are so accustomed to violence in the media, in fiction, we become very desensitized when we see violence that is not fictional on the news. We're so used to violent images that in a lot of ways we can forget, because it's on TV, and there's so many other, disturbing images available for us on TV. We can place that distance and forget that that this is real and that people are really suffering. Now, one of the and so I think that one of the good possibilities of the internet here is that you can use it to build empathy and therefore build peace. I do think it's an incredibly difficult task, um, just because we're talking about a places, plural, where the U.S. has been involved for decades, and where military action leads to more military action, leads to more military action. So how do you actually begin to build peace out of that situation? And now the biggest conflict right now, as of this recording, although we could move back into Iraq very quickly, is in Syria. In 2011, protests against the government of Bashar al-Assad, turned into an armed rebellion. And this armed rebellion is from ISIS as well as a number of other rebel groups. Now, like so many other of the wars in the region, it's become a proxy war for the US and Russia. So Russia and Iran continue to support Assad and oppose all the rebel groups. The US opposes ISIS but supports other rebel groups, and agrees that Assad must fall eventually. Now, over the course of since 2011, we've had 250,000 civilian casualties, which is a lot. Imagine that's twice the population of Fort Collins, okay? But even more striking, and I'm going to move my head so you can see this, is the number of people who have been displaced. 11 million people, half the population of Syria's 22 million, have been displaced from their homes. So far, of the 4 million registered refugees, the US has accepted 12,000. To put that in context, the rest of the international community, particularly the countries Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, have accepted the vast majority of really almost 3 million refugees. And these are small countries that are really struggling to support that type of an increase in population. So I want you to think about, where the US's responsibility lies, in terms of simply helping out our allies in the region, and being a good citizen of the international community. Now, a quick resource that I wanted to point you towards. This is a really great way of getting up-to-date news. 20-year-old Thomas van Lee, I hope I'm saying that correctly, of the Netherlands, is a cartographer and activist who publishes up-to-date maps of the areas of conflict around the world. So he does Syria, he also has Iraq, he also has a couple of other conflict regions. It's really, really interesting to look at. And his blog has become such a great source of information that CNN actually now will show it for reference. So if you want to know up to date what is happening in Syria, this is actually one of your better sources. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts from Code Pink. This is an international organization of women advocating for peace. Now, I am not allowed to weigh in on the current presidential election as a college employee, but I can tell you that this is Code Pink's position for a world without war. 1, reduce military spending, invest at home. 2, use diplomacy first. 3, abide by international law, no unauthorized wars. 4, work towards a no nukes peaceful world. 5, promote women in peacemaking. 6, end US support for Israel's occupation. 7, end weapons sales to human rights violators. 8, end the militarization of police departments and borders. 9, stop illegal detention of prisoners in Gitmo, hold torturers accountable. 10, respect whistleblowers and our privacy. I'll leave you with that to think about those important issues, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.